fine, where you are. Yeah, that's fine.
Right, good afternoon, morning, afternoon, folks. I'm going to get started because we're sort of already into our time. Stephen is not here today, so you're left with myself and Kieran. We're going to do a bit on explaining and modelling. Okay, tough audience. Come on in. The more the merrier. Here, take one of these.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Are you having that table?
Yeah. This is for volume because we don't have a microphone.
So, explaining and modelling is one of the broad areas within the walkthroughs. Maybe one of the areas people are focusing on when it comes to the lesson study program as well. And within explaining and modelling answers, a whole range of different techniques and pedagogical approaches people can take. So I think today we're going to talk quite broadly about explanations. I'm going to talk a little bit about schema and schema building, which I think is important for people to have a sense of before we you sort of move on with your modelling and explanation. So like always with these, they are broken down into sort of different elements within the task, and I was trying to think of something that I've been trying to explain with difficulty to kids this week, and trying to get them to get their heads around things where there are, I think, problems in their understanding, or where there are common misconceptions that have been thrown out and have identified. So the one I've chosen, it's quite topical, our new Prime Minister, was how someone becomes Prime Minister in the UK, and is our current Prime Minister legitimate? So my higher politics class have been looking at legitimacy and questions of legitimacy, what makes someone legitimate, and tied into that is the question of how somebody becomes Prime Minister, because I think there's a common misconception that with that individual is elected almost like a presidential style election in the UK amongst the kids, and that's quite a common misconception I identify, or that there has to be a general election for someone to be the Prime Minister, which again is not the case. So you had identified that was an issue, and this was part of the explanation I was trying to do. So you should start off with setting up a big question. Okay. There are some examples. For me, it was, is Prime Minister Liz Truss a legitimate Prime Minister? It was a question that we were trying to explore. And I think then the first aspect of this, and this is where this question of schema and schema building comes into it, is really clearly identifying what the prior knowledge is for different kids. And getting a sense of where they're coming from, because many of them will have slightly different background, bases in their minds when they're thinking about a Prime Minister. They might know what a Prime Minister does, they might have in their head a few ideas of people who are Prime Minister. They might only have Boris Johnson, which is a dangerous thing to have in your mind, okay, especially when you're thinking about the legitimacy of the Prime Minister. So establishing what their understanding of some of the key concepts and key ideas before you develop the explanation is key. I think, this idea of working out what the schema is quite important. So I'm just going to play a brief clip from Tom Sheringham talking about schema and schema building, and he will explain it in a much better way than I can.
The idea that knowledge in our long-term memories, in our brains, forms in a network of concepts and ideas which form a schema. And this is how we remember things. So, for example, if I was to suddenly sap you somewhere, let's say New York. Now, you weren't thinking about New York until a second ago, probably, but now we're in New York. We find that we have a schema for New York, and we can explore it. We can go into our memory and explore our schema for New York. And we think about it in terms of its geography, some film associations, and even if you've been there, you'll have memories of things that you did there, the roads, the smells, the place you went for lunch. But you weren't thinking about that before. So when we have a schema for an idea and we then try to remember it, a lot of that knowledge can come to our short-term memories altogether. But significantly, it doesn't arrive there altogether. We have to actually build our schema slowly over time. And really importantly, when you're teaching a concept to a class of individuals, everybody's schema is different, sometimes significantly different. So when we're trying to teach new knowledge to children, we've got to be thinking, how does this fit to their existing schema? So new knowledge builds on existing knowledge, and the more sophisticated your prior knowledge is, the more elaborate your schema, the more easy it is for you to assimilate new information and to make it stick, because you've got more different ways to connect the information. So the more you know, the more you can know, and you can't know too much. So building knowledge is really, really important as a notion for what teachers are trying to do. I think it has implications for what we then need to do as teachers in terms of being responsive in our questions. Because if we're just thinking about giving information to students, hoping that they'll be forming the schema, we could be wrong. We could actually be failing for that knowledge to stick at all because their foundations are too weak. Or, importantly, they could be actually connecting things in an incorrect way because their prior knowledge was slightly lacking and their schemas could be filled with misconceptions. So we need to be aware of that and always be thinking, right, how has this knowledge been assimilated by all of my students? And in order to do that, I need to get a lot more information back to me as a teacher from my students about what they've understood. So I can check whether they've understood or whether the schema that they're forming around this idea has taken shape. That implies lots more questioning, lots more interactive, probing questioning. And it also means that when one student's answer can never represent the learning of others because we don't know how their prior knowledge, their schema will have formed. The other major thing is that we need to anticipate common misconceptions, and there are lots of them. There are lots of them in science, there are lots of them in maths, there are lots of them about history. And if we know the kind of common things that often form a poor schema, we can anticipate those. Because here's another thing about schemas. If you just try to overwrite a primitive schema with a more sophisticated one, unless that old schema never really disappears, it doesn't like evaporate, it's still there. Unless the new knowledge is very strong and kind of masks the old one, students can revert back to their primitive schema quite easily. So even if I, for example, tell you that the mass of a tree mainly comes from the air because carbon dioxide is absorbed through trees' leaves, and that's the heavier molecule in photosynthesis. The intuition a lot of children have is that most of the mass of a tree comes from the soil, because that's more intuitive, and the schema for how trees grow is that they come out of the ground. So to overlearn that, I've got to correct that schema of the material from a tree coming mainly from the air, requires you to address the misconception head on and actually break that down and explain and deal with that misconception directly. That's more likely to be effective than just hoping that the new idea will overshadow the old one, because the likelihood is that it won't. So there we go. Thinking about this idea of schemas, the differences between individuals, and the conscious and conspicuous need to build schemas that are correct and provide solid foundations for future learning, I think it's really powerful, really effective. And once you think that way as a teacher, I think you're going to make better decisions when you come to asking questions and setting tasks.
Okay, so again, back in relation to this, it was about trying to establish from my class what their misconceptions were, a bit of a sense of that, but doing a lot of questioning beforehand, making sure they understood the key terms that we're going to be talking about. In this case, what legitimacy was, what the Prime Minister was, who the current Prime Minister was, and just establishing all of that information before we went into the broader explanation. And then, in this broadest sense of delivering an explanation, when it's a sort of almost conceptual idea, it's trying to create a sort of sense of narrative with it. Now, when I was doing this, that was quite straightforward, because some of these events are either happening at that time or were still quite fresh in the kids' mind. Use lots of visual aids. You could shove up a picture of, here is Boris Johnson, here is an election victory, what's happened? Well, he's won the election in 2019. He, therefore, is the Prime Minister. And that's kind of what they had as a sense. You become Prime Minister because you win an election. And then, what happens? The plot twist. Boris Johnson has lots of parties at Downing Street. Rishi Sunak and others resign from the cabinet, and he's forced out. Then the descending action, what happens? Boris Johnson is gone. And that's the bit where they were confused then about, Liz Truss she wins the Conservative Party leadership. All she needs to do is win Conservative Party membership, and then she automatically becomes Prime Minister. So again, through the use of sort of visual aids and pictures and images, we're able to sequence those events to try to establish that explanation of how somebody becomes Prime Minister, and then question whether that is legitimate. Does that have a sense of rightfulness amongst the public because she hasn't faced an election? Basically, that's what I was doing. But it was this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and what's the consequence? There was a sequential narrative to the explanation with a few props that I don't have at the minute. And part of the reason of this is more broadly, they were looking at this question of legitimacy of political leaders. Gordon Brown was in exactly the same position. He ascended to Prime Minister when Tony Blair went. When it was all going swimmingly for him initially for a couple of months, he refused to have a general election, and then people started to go, hold on a second, is he a legitimate Prime Minister? And their questions were raised about the legitimacy of his leadership. So, I wanted to be able to get them to use that example then to explain why some political leaders lack legitimacy. So, I was building on that one, adding additional concrete examples in, and then using that to try and establish an understanding of the concept of legitimacy. Okay, and at the end, as you would normally do, just a recap of understanding and consolidate that. Now, that's obviously it's a higher politics example, but it was the one that came in my mind, and I've just done this week. And people struggled with it, a couple of misconceptions earlier on. I made assumptions about what they already knew, which clearly were wrong, because they did have these misconceptions about how someone becomes a Prime Minister. So I had to go back and sort of challenge those misconceptions, think a little bit about their schema, what they already know, and kind of begin to break that down, and then move forward. So in the last sort of 10, 15 minutes, I think in your groups, if you have a bit of a conversation, an idea of any concepts or ideas, explanations that you've tried in the past, or actually there are quite a lot of common misconceptions here. Kids just don't get this. What is it they're not getting? Is there an issue with their preconceived ideas, their schema that needs to be challenged? So where could you possibly bring this in within your own subject areas? How might you develop that? Are there explanations? This will lend itself to certain ideas and certain concepts easier than others, but are there explanations that you could use that narrative approach with props and visual aids and so on to get across the main idea, and then link it with other further examples? Okay, so yeah, I'll shut up. Over to you.
Probably on the affirmation to start with. I suppose the issue for us as well that the teachers are using the law, like the kids think that's the example. Prosecute things like this and that, or police and instead of guarantee evidence. If it's not to a deal rate or that punish people, or take it to the type of the police and punish people, well, that's not actually crazy. Step-by-step process. You need to go back and say this.
And the whole idea was to teach them legitimacy. That was that. The whole thing here was
That was the example.
Example here, legitimacy.
Yeah.
What does that
What is it
mean?
What is CDTs then?
I'm trying to think if you were using the same approach, if there was some sort of process.
Even a design process of
Well, there is a design process, but it's not necessarily linear. I can talk about skills, but I don't know if that's... Like when you're teaching perspective, sketching for example, they don't always put the lines running in the right direction. And to me it's obvious.
How do you combat that?
Sorry?
How do you then combat that?
I would have a real object, because you're starting off with boxes, so you'd have a real object and you would explain that that edge is running a vertical direction. And when you're drawing the line on the paper, it needs to run parallel to the edge of the paper. Right, it can't be running at an angle. And some of them, sometimes, like when you're doing it, if you're doing an isometric, they don't know what parallel means. So you have to then explain parallel. So you kind of have these conversations. I usually use the mistake. Can you teach the skill and then like you see the ones that make that mistake all the time and then you throw the whole class as a what's wrong with it? Right? And some of them obviously know what's wrong with it, and other ones they all know there's something wrong with it. They don't explain it, yes. Because all subjects are skill based. We didn't really
misunderstanding the idea.
we didn't have in-depth conversations possibly. Certainly on departments, that example.
So then you've got to prove that to them.
Thinking maybe design concepts then.
Why like this? Why am I seeing a rainbow? And it is. It's like you said, returning back to the basics stuff. They remember that. I say, so you know, have you seen light shine from the busy? Yeah, it makes a rainbow.
Different joints.
And they don't understand why it makes a rainbow. They've done it, but they haven't.
It's always like you contextualise it. Like a joint, you think like you've shown them what's the joints, but they have difficulty understanding what joint to use in what context. And you're talking about the fact, well, it depends what you're making. You know, if you're making a table or a chair, certainly a chair is going to have to support something. You need to have a joint that's going to be strong enough to do that job. Right? If you're making, you know, pencil holder, that's not as important. It's actually
misconceptions in science or
anything? Aesthetically, it's
So you can take paint and mix it and make it white.
they don't always understand why they use the joint, why they reduce the joint. So you have these conversations. Try to think of design ones and graphic ones. planned obsolescence. I've had conversations about planned obsolescence.
That wouldn't be my description.
That's where companies
Like, that's every bit.
want
So, you know, and that's obviously.
an annual turnover. So how do they achieve it? Because they didn't want everybody to buy the product and sit back and say, well, that's great, because the profit will go up, and it'll drop, and it'll saturate, and it begins to drop. So they use planned obsolescence to introduce new features to keep them buying. Basically, is this a good thing? But that actually usually goes into like, is planned obsolescence a good thing? And obviously for the market it's not a good thing because they're using the resources, they're able to dispose all the waste and everything, recycling, so. But it's a good thing for the company because the company will go bust otherwise, so probably that would come with kind of higher design. Didn't really have a lot of these conversations depends on
So, folks, only a few minutes left. I just wonder whether anyone's got any sort of examples of clear misconceptions that they've come across, or this issue, the problem with schema in children's minds about certain things in particular that you might go back next time and think, right, I need to really break that down as part of my explanation, really establish clearly the basics before moving on. Time to share. Mrs. Sharp.
So, in maths, one of the biggest misconceptions I always think is the understanding of fractions. So kids will go 1/3, add 1/4, makes 2/7, because you add the top numbers and you add the bottom numbers, and that must be the answer. And our practice in recent years has gone back to what's called CPA, which is concrete, pictorial, abstract. So
I was just talking about this actually. It was the things that kids don't have a sense sometimes of what a third or a quarter looks like.
Yeah,
so we think they all do because
start off
I know
by,
what a half pizza looks like.
Yeah. And we're talking about that because we're talking about cakes and pizzas and that's what, right. But we actually now tend to more talk about blocks because kids seem to understand square things and it's a bit more logical than having things round. So we'll get we can get blocks out and we can start to explain what 1/3 looks like, and then 1/3 is the same as how many twelfths and 1/4 is the same as how many twelfths. Then we use what's called bar modelling, which I did a wee bit of stuff on last year up in maths and science as well, technologies, where we talk about the bars and splitting it up in equal bits, and then we come back to the abstract. So every time the kids don't remember it, when you come back to it again, you go, but remember when we did this bar and we split it into bits. So yeah, that's what I related mine to when I was talking to Caroline.
I think there were loads of examples, Jack, a little bit sort of misconceptions in geography as well. We're getting a lot with the current S1s.
Geography scale and geography size and things like that. They come and they think that, and still in fourth year, they think that Africa's a country, no matter how many times I've told them that it's not. So, how do I get better? What am I doing? Why am I? How ineffective am I if I can't get that message across to them by showing them pictures, by doing these things, by illustrating this in different ways? But also another thing is they don't understand Britain's place in the world and where we are geographically, because actually our maps have provide us misconceptions anyway, because the UK isn't the size that it is. It's the same size as Florida. So the kids don't understand that. They think that we are, and they can't conceptually get that idea that Greenland isn't the same size as Europe and the UK isn't the same. That's the idea, and it's how do I make that what seems very simple to me? How do I make sure that my young people know that as a basic foundation or a basic building block?
Yeah, I think it's that sort of idea of that you kind of tell them once or twice, because the sort of embedded schema will be the one that comes back. It's constantly going back over it. So identifying those misconceptions and continually going back to them before you start the wider explanation. So I think if you're thinking about explanations and modelling as something that you're maybe going to focus on, particularly in lesson study, as I say, that's just a kind of a broad overview of maybe a conceptual explanation, one way to do it. There are lots of different techniques within that, but I think broadly, if you're taking this back into classrooms and practice, just be conscious of those misconceptions and that idea of schema building, and making sure that you're establishing those foundations, I think, before moving on, and just be aware of it and look out for it.